The Boeing 747, the world's first jumbo jet and the most successful passenger airliner in history.
The Jumbo is a very special, iconic machine. This is a game changer of an aeroplane.
I've not met anyone who hasn't loved it.
Designed to carry double the number of passengers of previous planes, it brought long-haul travel to the masses.
People could go to see the places they'd never dreamt of going.
For the first time in history, you can travel from anywhere in the world to any other point on the globe.
Now celebrating its 50th birthday, the 747's birth had been complicated.
I had 22 engine failures in 18 months, of which 18 went big bang.
And then threats to its safety.
The security was nothing like it is nowadays. There was no lock on the door then, you could just open the door.
But it would soon become every airline's flagship, beloved of passengers.
You didn't feel like you were on an airplane. You were in a restaurant or in someone's home.
Of pilots.
I reckon in an hour I could teach somebody to fly one. And that, to me, is the proof of what an incredible handling airplane this is.
And crew.
When I had decided that I wanted to be cabin crew, I wanted to fly on the big birds. That was the ultimate of my career, was to get onto the 747.
This is the story of the plane that shrank the globe.
I think it could be considered as important as the internet, in that it brought the world closer together.
September the 30th, 1968, and thousands gather outside the Boeing aircraft factory in Washington State.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that this great plane is rolling out on schedule, in the very fine condition it's in, is a tremendous testimonial to literally thousands of people.
The occasion? The unveiling of the world's first wide-body passenger jet, the 747.
And those doors roll back, and out of the darkness comes the nose of this beautiful airplane. Just an incredible moment. And of course the crowd cheers, and then the airplane is put into position.
It created an audible gasp as it rolled out from the hangar because it was so big. A really enormous thrill to see something of this size rolled out for the first time.
In the 50 years that followed, the 747 has been at the center of nearly every development in the world of commercial aviation, enabling passengers to fly further than ever, sparking fierce price wars that have brought down the costs of travel, being on the front line of the terror threat, and becoming the jet of choice for everyone, from presidents and prime ministers to entrepreneurs and rock stars. But above all, it's been the people's airliner.
The 747 was the plane which was the opening shot in the aviation revolution that brought long haul for all.
And it was the airplane that basically brought together continents and people and cultures and economies. And as such, it was the first airplane in a long line of airplanes that have profoundly changed the world.
London's Heathrow Airport took the arrival of the world's first fully loaded jumbo jet with surprising ease.
But the journey started off bumpily. When the 747 made its maiden flight from New York to London in 1970, its owners were still hiding a secret. It had been rushed into service faster than any plane in history. As a result, there was an unresolved fault. One that caused the engines to overheat and even catch fire.
It was way more than teething problems, but what kept the airplane in the air was the way people were working together. And that was everybody from the engine guy to the suppliers to Boeing to our crew training pilots to the airlines themselves.
But a solution for the teething trouble still proved elusive. By March 1970, Boeing were making 7 planes a month and supplying them to airlines all over the world. They included Britain's state-owned BOAC, soon to be relaunched as British Airways. Its pilots quickly realized how unreliable the 747's engines were.
I was on the first course as a pilot. It wasn't really until we started flying the aircraft we became aware of the engine problems.
They were just horrendous. They would break at the drop of a hat. In fact, without the curvature of the Earth, I don't think the Jumbo would have got airborne out of Heathrow. I had 22 engine failures in 18 months, of which 18 went big bang.
Boeing hoped that America's safety regulator would allow the 747 to fly because the company had built in a wide range of backup systems, including its 4 separate engines.
You can fly it on one. So one engine failing was just an inconvenience. And that was the secret of it staying in the air, really.
The airlines were also prepared to live with the initial engine faults. The 747 had proved an instant hit with passengers, and no other plane could compete with its capacity and range.
But in BOAC, it was considered an ideal airplane for our operation. We started with 3 in 1970, and fairly quickly we were operating 12 airplanes, and successfully because we were making money.
Key to the 747's money-making potential was its size. It could accommodate 450 paying passengers.
Space was really the USP of the 747. It really was transformative inside as well as outside when you're just looking at this thinking, crikey, that's big.
But that size also brought problems. Hundreds of passengers meant hundreds of security checks. And in 1970, security was taking on a new importance.
Small minority of violent terrorists put in jeopardy the whole structure of international communications. Once the skyjackers are allowed to hold the world to ransom, we will have paid a price to lawlessness that can never be redeemed.
Hijacking had emerged as a favorite tactic by Middle Eastern terrorist groups. That year, they took control of a series of planes, forcing the pilots to divert, holding passengers as hostages, and in some cases, destroying the aircraft.
The Middle East, and a week of drama and tension comes to an explosive end.
To some, the 747 looked especially vulnerable. It carried more passengers than other planes, and the onboard protection measures were surprisingly relaxed. Access to the flight deck was easy.
The security was nothing like it is nowadays. There was no lock on the door then. You could just open the door.
Then, in September 1970, Palestinian militants targeted the 747. They hijacked Pan Am Flight 93, carrying 152 passengers and 17 crew, at Amsterdam Airport. It was due to fly to New York, but they forced it to divert to Beirut, where they picked up enough explosives to destroy the entire plane. They then flew to their final destination.
Pan America's 747 jumbo jet. After being diverted to Beirut, the jumbo was forced to fly to Cairo.
Whilst en route, the crew discovered the hijackers did intend to blow up the plane, lighting the fuse on the explosives as it came into land. Once on the ground, the passengers would have a maximum of 90 seconds in which to evacuate.
But we want you to do this here as swiftly and as easily so that nobody will get hurt.
But would it be possible for all of them to get off this giant new plane in such a short space of time? Fortunately, Boeing had designed the wide-body shape with emergency evacuation in mind, and now it would be put to the ultimate test.
Tell you, go down to the bottom of the ramp and then get away from the aircraft.
Incredibly, the crew did manage to evacuate the plane in under a minute and a half. Everyone on board was taken to safety.
lit the fuses before we got off the airplane. They knew how long the fuses were going to take. Everybody got out and they ran from the airplane as fast as they could go.
But while the hostages survived, the plane did not. Moments later, the 747 blew up. The hijacking shook the aviation world. But, despite the threats, lower fares and the chance to cross continents kept passenger numbers growing. The 747, with its huge capacity, was key to the opening up of the skies.
Suddenly, something which was completely unattainable for normal working people began to be within their reach.
In the first year, 6 million people fly, and they fly 72 million miles. The 747 does an incredible job.
You could now fly from London to New York for £103 return.
Like the Concorde, this is going to be the future of air travel.
Just a year after its maiden flight, the 747 was taking passengers to all corners of the globe. Every major airline was putting in new orders for the plane. But for Boeing, there was sudden and unexpected turbulence ahead. And it threatened to put the 747 out of production altogether. In the 50 years since the first 747 came out of the Boeing factory near Seattle, around 1,500 have entered service. It's been the long-haul workhorse for every major airline in the world. But just a year after its first commercial flight, production nearly ground to a halt. And this was the reason. By 1971, America had lost the race to launch the world's first commercial supersonic plane. The US government had paid Boeing $1.5 billion to come up with a rival to Concorde. But while the Anglo-French plane was undergoing test flights, Boeing's SST project had barely got off the drawing board, and it continued to hemorrhage cash.
There was no way that, therefore, that the economics of the supersonic transport would ever really work.
Unless you could get the cost way down, you weren't going to sweep the industry with SSTs.
In May 1971, the US Congress cancelled funding for the supersonic airliner, and the project was scrapped. But Boeing, which was heavily in debt, had come to rely on the subsidy. Once it was withdrawn, it had to slash 60,000 jobs, cutting its workforce by nearly 2/3.
The effects on the Seattle area were, in fact, huge. At that time, Boeing was the big company of Seattle.
The time became so dark and dire here in Seattle that some real estate agents put up a sign that said, "Will the last person to leave Seattle please turn out the lights?"
With its supersonic project dead, Boeing had to pin all its survival hopes on the 747. And the gamble soon paid off. By the end of its first 12 months, airlines had bought nearly 100 of the new jumbos. And when the engine fault that had dogged the plane was finally fixed a year later, demand soared.
Once we got the engine problem solved, sales increased tremendously.
Almost just within a couple of years, this just changes our world. The 747 saves the company and carries it into the future.
By the end of its third year in service, the 747 had carried more than 35 million people. The age of the jumbo had truly arrived.
Well, the introduction of the 747 really brought about travel for the general public It was very much for people who had money or were working for big companies that would travel. When the 747 came in, all of a sudden there were lots of seats available.
Increased availability meant increased demand. There were more planes in the sky. And more pilots all getting to grips with the Jumbo's unique characteristics.
You were part of a revolution, really, in aviation. It was a massive aeroplane, and there was a hell of a lot of new technology on
it. The size. It was like landing a block of flats because you were the equivalent of about a second or third floor of a building.
It's a surprisingly agile airplane. For such a big airplane, you can really throw the airplane around the sky.
I mean, it would be like a terrific airplane to do acrobatics with.
The wing is so forgiving and just cushions that landing at the last minute.
It's hard to make a bad landing in this airplane.
And then the thing that sometimes people forget is that once you've landed the main wheels, the nose wheel is still, you know, a double-decker bus in the air. You now have to land the airplane twice. Otherwise, first-class passengers really object. Because they get this, bang! Who did that? You know?
Flying on the 747 was a new experience, even for seasoned air travelers. On earlier single-aisle planes, conditions were cramped. No longer.
The two luxuries in the world are space and time, and they cut the time that you could travel to foreign places, but they also gave you plenty of space.
Nearly all the extra capacity was to be found in economy, the twin-aisle main cabin. Even those paying the cheapest fares could travel in comfort.
The 747 was so unique because it was 2 aisles. It was so much larger. It didn't seem like an airplane. It was more like you were entering into a vast, grand living room. And with 2 aisles, you could walk around.
Although the 747 had space for 450 seats, airlines like Pan Am and BOAC put in fewer. For them, space was the Jumbo's unique selling point.
A lot of the airlines took advantage of the size of this airplane to really expand on the whole glamour of flight. People would dress up, they would wear jacket and tie, and the women would wear their best.
We didn't look out of place in our white gloves and our suits.
Right now, I'm wearing the uniform that would have been worn right after the launch of the 747. Flight attendants that wore this often say this was their very favorite uniform, with the bowler hat and the jaunty English riding suit look. And actually, for us, it was the shortest skirt we ever had, because it was the era of the miniskirt.
To add to the sense of event, 747 passengers were treated to in-flight entertainment. Revolutionary at the time.
Look, you could watch a movie as you were flying along, and they even used in the advertising the term the sitting room in the sky.
We used to pull down a screen at the front of each cabin, and people would sit there with their headsets on and watch this film.
And it had the bright blue plastic headsets that looked like stethoscopes.
Certainly, it made our lives a little bit easier because they would sit transfixed actually for a couple of hours.
The Jumbo jet had introduced economy passengers to new levels of luxury. But whatever the standards in the main cabin, they were nothing compared to those upstairs.
The upper deck on the 747 in the 70s was hallowed ground, really, because only first-class passengers could access it. Up a spiral staircase.
The spiral staircase in the original 747 was a unique invention, but it actually became the staircase to heaven for the passengers.
The upper deck gave the 747 its most distinctive design feature, the hump. It was housed behind the flight deck.
747, it's iconic, the shape. It's an artistic form that captures our imagination. I mean, unless you're an airplane nut like me, it's one airplane looks like the other. But the 747 is, you recognize it, that distinctive hump.
It was the space inside the hump that offered new opportunities for exclusivity. Some airlines installed piano lounges, others cocktail bars and restaurants.
There was a bar, which we used to work behind, and we used to make these ridiculous cocktails. Give me a Manhattan on the rocks, you know.
And they'd set it on the bar, along with some cocktails and smoke, and it was just like they were in a bar. Very social, and it was smoky. You didn't feel like you were on an airplane. You were in a restaurant or in someone's home at a dinner party.
The dining services that we're seeing in some of these airlines are just fantastic. Like the greatest hotels in the world, you would have a similar experience.
The upper deck, Pan Am deliberately positioned it as the $23 million flying penthouse, whereas British Airways started talking about club class. So you have the idea already of people sitting in the comfort of their own homes downstairs, but upstairs you're in an elite club.
As well as generating money for the airlines, these additional features helped keep passengers occupied. For the first time, they were experiencing long haul, spending hours on end in the air as they flew to far-off destinations.
One of the reasons why it's such a big airplane was the mission for this airplane was to fly great distances. For the first time in history, you can travel from anywhere in the world to any other point on the globe.
Airlines like British Airways portrayed the 747 as the key to your wildest holiday dreams.
People were going off to India and going to Goa and dropping out as hippies and Far East Hong Kong. It was just fantastic. I can remember taking people to Africa and they were going on safaris and they were just so excited. I think as fares came down, people were able to go and visit their families that they perhaps hadn't seen for donkey's years. People could go and see their relatives in Australia.
Capable of carrying over 160 tons of fuel, the 747 made even the longest routes less daunting. It cut the journey time from London to Sydney from 34 hours to 25, with just 2 stops instead of the previous 5.
If you look at the 747 at the time, I think it could be considered as important as the internet. It was like an analog version of the World Wide Web in that it brought the world closer together.
By the mid-70s, the 747 was the queen of the skies and the flagship for all the world's major airlines. Its supremacy looked assured. But then another threat appeared on the horizon.
I don't care what fare you've got. Mine is the cheapest and the lowest fare for the same standard, the same quality, the same comfort.
(1977). The Boeing 747 had revolutionized commercial aviation, making long-haul travel available to all. But by today's standards, fares were still expensive. There was virtually no competition within the heavily regulated airline industry, and little incentive to cut prices. But then came a new disruptive player in the market.
I don't care what fare you've got. Mine is the cheapest and the lowest fare for the same standard, the same quality, the same comfort.
Freddie Laker was a bit of a scallywag, you know, definitely a man of the people, and he positioned himself that way. People identified with him.
Laker was a serial entrepreneur who started out running charter flights from the south of England to Europe. Since 1971, he'd been seeking permission to run the first daily low-fare transatlantic service.
The other way, mate. Let's have the SkyTrain on.
After 6 years of lobbying, the authorities finally agreed. Laker launched the SkyTrain, a new walk-on service from London Gatwick to New York. One-way price, £59, a third of what established carriers were charging.
The start of the low-cost airways began with Freddie Laker. Before EasyJet, before Ryanair, before Southwest in the United States, you had Freddie Laker and his SkyTrain.
Laker's second-hand DC-10 planes and cut-price fares posed a huge threat to the economic viability of the 747. The major airlines had tried to persuade the regulators to block his new service. When that failed, they had only one option left: to slash the cost of their own tickets.
His price is probably pretty unrealistic, but if he's gotten the go-ahead, we're definitely going to get into the ballgame and match him.
Suddenly, things could be competitive. Before, fares were all set, and airlines competed more on sort of the personality of the airline, and all of a sudden it was, where's the cheapest ticket?
The first major airline price war had brought lower prices for 747 passengers. But from now on, the experience of flying on it would be very different. To make up for the loss in revenue, the airlines began filling all the empty space with seats.
As fares dropped, we did get more and more people crammed in.
In 1980 came the next generation jumbo, the 747-300. 23 feet longer than its predecessors, this new 747 had over 600 seats, fitting in 150 more paying customers. To help free up space, Boeing replaced the distinctive spiral staircase to the upper deck with a straight stairway. For airline staff, the extra seats meant extra work.
It just became a bit more frantic, I suppose. We were busier, we were running up and down more often, we were serving more drinks, we were serving more meals.
The staff may have been busier than before, but the price cuts and design modifications did their job. As the 1980s dawned, the planes were operating with every seat booked.
Over the years I was flying, I joined in 1973 when people were still, you know, fairly sort of middle class and people had a bit of money, but then I noticed it changing. Towards the end of my time, 1981, people were becoming more casually dressed and they would wear jeans, they would wear tracksuits. They were comfortable.
Now the premium is on the economy of travel. That high-end special passenger experience that we once had, it still exists, but it exists to a much lesser scale than it once did in the early days of the 747.
Although the 747's design and pricing structure had changed, one feature remained constant: the commitment to safety. Right from the start, Boeing's engineers had built in spare, or so-called redundant mechanisms that would come into play in the event of any problems. Their ambition was to build a jet that was uncrashable.
It's one of the most substantial, robust airplanes that has ever been built.
It doesn't matter what you throw at it, it will respond. It doesn't matter whether it's snow, ice, wind, turbulence.
Lightning strikes, engine failures. This airplane just takes it and it keeps flying and it gets you back home.
There's so much redundancy. You've got 4 engines.
4 electrical systems.
There are 4 hydraulic systems on the 747, all of them powering the flight controls. You can lose 3, you can still control the airplane.
I think any pilot flying the 747 would feel that the airplane is going to look after him. I think that is the reassurance that that sort of capability gives, the ability to fly with 3 of those engines failed. And we train everyone in order to get to that position.
But what would happen in the event of all 4 engines failing? One night in 1982, a UK pilot was to find out. Captain Eric Moody was flying a British Airways 747-200, carrying 263 passengers from Heathrow to New Zealand. Whilst over Indonesia, his plane was suddenly enveloped in darkness. Unknowingly, he'd flown into a blanket of ash cloud caused by a volcanic eruption. Today, the mere threat of ash clouds can be enough to ground an aircraft. But this potentially lethal environment can be recreated to give pilots the training they need on a 747 simulator like this one, flown by qualified jumbo pilot and frontman of Iron Maiden, Bruce Dickinson.
Well, what we've got here is a 747-400 simulator, so climb aboard. Now, with regards to volcanic ash, so there is a nasty black volcanic ash cloud, and we're going to go climbing up towards it. Of course, Eric Moody wouldn't have had any idea that he was heading in this direction. Oh, that's nasty.
Even 35 years on, Eric Moody still remembers every second of the ash cloud flight.
The flight engineer, he saw that number 4 engine was slowly running down.
Engine number 4's not happy. 34,000 feet, here we go. All right, that's an engine surge.
And he called out engine failure number 4 engine.
Captain Moody and his crew still didn't know what had caused the engine failure. Conditions inside the flight deck were confusing and chaotic.
Condition volcanic ash suspected. One or more of these occur. Static discharge around the windshield, a bright glow in the engine inlets. Objective
bank angle.
To exit the ash cloud
bank
and
angle.
restart the engines.
He then said something like, number 2's gone, number 3's gone, and goodness me, we've lost the lot.
Exit the volcanic ash as quickly as blow the nose.
Yep.
Exit the volcanic ash as quickly as possible.
We didn't believe what we were seeing, because it just doesn't happen. You don't get 4 engine failures. There we were, the proud possessors of the world's heaviest and largest glider.
Eric Moody is probably flying it on this. That's a standby flight airspeed indicator. He's just got his flight engineer, and he's got to figure it all out in the middle of a dark and stormy night.
When the volcanic ash went into the engine, by the time it got back to the burners, all of that silica turned to glass and clogged up the back end of the engine, which would surge it and stop it.
If Eric Moody and his crew were going to get themselves and their 263 passengers home safely, they would have to rely on all the 747's famed robustness and handling capability.
The aeroplane is so responsive, and it was all the way through that incident. With no engines going, it handled as well as it did with all 4 going.
Let's try and restart number 1 and number 3. Bang, 1 and 4.
And as he came down, that glass inside the engine cooled significantly to the point where the glass shattered, established an airflow, and allowed Moody and his crew to restart a couple of those engines.
Oh, there we go. Bingo. Actually, we've got 3 engines back now.
And eventually restarted all 4 so that they could then successfully get over the mountains and put it down in Jakarta.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Let's go with full reverse.
So my theory is that at 15,000 feet, we came out the bottom of the ash. And that's why they all started again, because we came out into clear air.
Yeah, and I shall not be a national hero, because this is a simulator. I think Eric Moody deserves that gong.
I was so impressed with it during the whole of that incident that it didn't let us down, didn't let me down.
Against all the odds, the 747 proved once again how reliable it was. And in 1982, its reputation as an inexpensive as well as safe plane helped see off a threat closer to home. That year, Freddie Laker's airline, complete with its DC-10s, went bust.
As from 9:30 this morning, the receivers were called in, and the Laker Airways, as far as I'm concerned, ceased to function.
And just 2 years later, another charismatic entrepreneur entered the travel business. And he was smart enough to know there was only one plane for him, the 747.
In the highest of spirits, and happily not the pilot, Richard Branson, in spite of the failure of Laker Airways before him, he's not afraid of this new gamble.
Richard Branson brought his music industry experience into it. So, in a way, Virgin Atlantic was the MTV of the skies. It was fun, it was rock and roll, a bit irreverent.
I think with Virgin, it was new, it was fresh, it was breaking the rules. He brought that relaxing atmosphere to the 747. It didn't feel like you were flying to your holidays, it felt like you were on a social event before you got to your holidays.
The 747 offered the status for him because it was instantly recognisable. The brand was written all over it, and it basically launched him across the world, and it gave him kudos.
Virgin's entry into the market popularised even more long-haul destinations for Britons.
The working man and his family could go to Disneyland or Orlando. It was affordable. It wasn't a dream in the pipeline, it was a reality now.
Meanwhile, new modifications were enabling the 747 to travel faster and longer than ever before. By the end of the decade, it could fly a third of the way around the world without stopping. Its capabilities were even enough to make it the plane of choice for US presidents. In 1990, a special model came into service as Air Force One. Costing more than $200,000 an hour to fly, this jumbo is modified to enable those on board to survive during a nuclear conflict. It can be refueled in mid-air and is kitted out like a warplane with the latest military defense capabilities. Other world leaders soon followed suit.
I think the thing that attracted government to use the 747 when I was flying it was the sheer size of the aircraft, the ability that gave you to use the inside of the aircraft very flexibly. I flew both Mr. Brown and Mr. Blair when they were Prime Minister, and I think they all enjoyed using the 747 because it was just such a fabulous flying office for them. The Prime Minister could be isolated if necessary in his first-class area and conduct interviews with the press. The journalists who were filming the arrival would always film the airplane. It had such a big status with that big red, white and blue tail. It's sending a huge message when that thing rolls into the tarmac.
Although the 747 still carries the president, it's now no longer a plane for the American people. With the advent of more fuel-efficient, narrower jets, by the end of 2017, all major US airlines had stopped using it. And most other airlines are following suit. As the 747 celebrates its 50th birthday, does it really now have a future at all? For half a century, the Jumbo has enjoyed unrivaled success as a passenger jet, flying 5 billion of us around the world. In 2012, Boeing released the latest incarnation. The 747-8 with its stretched fuselage became the longest passenger aircraft in the world. Today, 150 of them are in the air or on order. But over the last decade, the 747's popularity has decreased, with airlines favoring smaller, more economical twin-engine planes like Boeing's 787 Dreamliner. For the 747, with its 4 engines, times have changed. There are now just over 500 flying, compared to 1,000 at the end of the 90s.
The world's changed. Everything now is about fuel saving, twin-engine aircraft are more reliable. And sadly, I think, the 747 has had its heyday.
And now we have airplanes that do this mission exceedingly well, so they're connecting point to point, so I understand why the size of airplanes may be going toward smaller airplanes for the passenger mission.
2/3 of all the 747s ever built have now been scrapped, written off, or put into storage. Their final resting places are often in so-called aircraft boneyards in the deserts of Arizona and California. Others are bound for facilities like this one at Cotswold Airport in the UK, where they're stripped for parts.
Over the 22 years we've been in business, we dismantled some 700 aircraft, and out of those 700 aircraft, I would say probably 50 of those are 747s. Unfortunately, there are actually more 747s being stored and being disassembled than there are actually operating at the moment, which is kind of the sign of the times. We've just boarded the aircraft through the number 1 doors. This is the business class area. We're going to wander through here to the economy class. The rest of the aircraft is high-density economy seating. Unfortunately, most of this interior will be scrapped. Very little requirement for interior from a 747. But we're going to head up to the flight deck and I'll show you what's been removed, which are some pretty valuable pieces of kit. There's only a few more bits and pieces in here which we need to remove. The seats, for one, they're pretty expensive. Also need to take out some of the screens. Everything else, like the throttle quadrant, the yoke, we often sell these things to pilots, collectors, whoever else wants to start up a 747.
The 747 may be experiencing a sad and slow decline as a passenger jet, but reports of its death are premature. From the very beginning, its designers had a dual function in mind. Its raised flight deck and hinged nose made it the world's leading cargo plane. And that's not likely to change just yet.
So we're just going into the 747 forward L1 door, which is the standard entry door, just as you get on a normal 747 passenger aircraft. But as you see when you get onto the aircraft, the differences are that the interior is completely stripped out. So today we're carrying electronics and consumable goods from the Far East. So one of the other excellent design features of the 747 is the huge cargo cabin. It's a 53-metre effective loading area, and that combined with the 3-metre high capability into the ceiling gives it a huge loading capability on the main deck. Follow me through this way. We'll take you through to the most iconic part of the aircraft, the nose visor. It's a tight bit. The nose cargo door of the 747 enables us to load very long pieces, outsized cargo through the nose of the aircraft. Where we are standing at the moment, we'll rotate a full 90 degrees out, and then the aircraft is just going to be bathed in light. As you see, it's a long way up into that point where the whole door is now up above our heads. It gives us complete access. But when I look back at the design teams, these guys were very forward thinking to be able to carry it forward into the future, and today be able to still carry outsized loads that are unrivaled by any other aircraft.
Whether the 747 survives as a cargo plane, a passenger carrier, or both, it will always be considered as a landmark development in aviation. No other subsonic airliner has ever represented such a technological leap forward. And with its size and range, it made the dream of long-haul travel for everyone a reality. 50 years after the first jumbo was unveiled, it continues to inspire admiration and affection.
The 747 coming to the end as a passenger aircraft will be like a big chunk of my life coming to an end. I mean, to think that I'll never get on another one again would be quite sad, actually.
Any pilot that's flown the 747 has to have a special place in his heart for this jet. You feel about this jet in ways that you just don't feel about other airplanes.
Doesn't matter what aeroplane they bring out in the future, nothing will replace the 747. I really did love that aeroplane. It was almost a romance that you never wanted to give up, and the memories of it will always stay with me.
This airplane has a special place in history that I think will always be secure. This has to be one of the major creations of mankind as a technical achievement that changed history.